A wildfire just did something it has never done in this city's history. It crossed a river, climbed a bluff, and burned straight into the middle of a mid-sized American city, tearing through blocks that had hydrants, sidewalks, and mailboxes. Spokane, Washington, is not supposed to be a wildfire city, but by nightfall, entire neighborhoods were gone, 65,000 people were fleeing, and officials were calling it the worst disaster their region has ever faced. And here's the part nobody caught in the first 48 hours. This fire wasn't caused by lightning, drought, or a downed power line at all. It started on a Saturday afternoon, the 1st of August, on the open grassland of the West Plains, just outside a place called Airway Heights. Nothing about that location suggested catastrophe. It was dry range and scattered brush, the kind of terrain that burns every fire season without ever making a headline. Officials had already flagged the day as dangerous. The National Weather Service had issued what's called a particularly dangerous situation alert, the highest tier of fire weather warning, because wind gusts were forecast to hit 35 to 40 miles an hour with humidity crashing into single digits. That combination alone was expected to produce fast fires. What it produced instead was something almost nobody planned for. The flames didn't stay in the grass. Driven by that wind, they raced northeast into Riverside State Park, tore through a shooting range, and then did the part that still doesn't sit right with longtime residents. They jumped the Spokane River. Rivers are supposed to be natural fire breaks. Water doesn't burn. But wind-driven embers don't need a bridge. In fire science, it's called spotting. Burning debris gets lofted ahead of the main flame front and can land still hot up to a mile downwind, starting new ignitions long before the fire itself arrives. At 40 miles an hour, a river that would normally stop a slow-moving ground fire becomes nothing more than a brief pause. The embers rode the gusts across the water, landed in dry vegetation on the far bank, and climbed straight up the bluffs into the Indian Trail and 5 Mile Prairie neighborhoods. Within hours, a wildfire that began in empty grassland was tearing through paved streets, driveways, and rooftops inside city limits. Exactly the kind of behavior fire crews plan for in wildland terrain and almost never plan for inside a city. One resident, Teresa Sullivan, was outside with a garden hose soaking her own house and her neighbors when she said it plainly. It had never been this close before. That single sentence captures the entire abnormality of what happened. Spokane has lived beside fire risk for generations. It has never had fire walk into its living rooms. By the next morning, the number came in, and it was staggering. 640 structures destroyed, according to Spokane County Fire District 3. That number kept moving as the week went on. It wasn't a mistake correcting itself. It was investigators working block by block through terrain still too hot to enter, confirming losses one address at a time. By the following week, the verified total had climbed past 900, most of it inside a handful of neighborhoods. Indian Trail, 5 Mile Prairie, and a stretch called Balboa, where rows of homes along a single road were reduced to their foundations. Bobby Atwood escaped with her dog, Luna, whose paws were burned in the process. Erin Conley returned to what had been her family home for 2 generations to pull a single surviving statue out of the ash. One homeowner, Joe Kvankara, managed to save his house by digging a fire line around it himself, and later described feeling something close to guilt for being one of the few whose home was still standing. Roughly 65,000 people inside Spokane's city limits were ordered out under Level 3 evacuations, the kind that simply read, "Leave now." Fairchild Air Force Base evacuated personnel and families from threatened housing. Schools across the Meade District emptied. Spokane's own courts suspended operations. Search teams spent the following days trying to account for more than a dozen people who couldn't immediately be reached, a detail that hung over the disaster for nearly 48 hours before officials confirmed no deaths. One local emergency official compared the destruction directly to 2 of the most devastating urban fires in recent American memory, the Eaton and Palisades fires that tore through the Los Angeles area. That comparison alone should tell you how unusual this was for a city like Spokane. Wind-driven fires that erase entire blocks of a major city are not supposed to be an inland Pacific Northwest problem. They're supposed to be a Southern California problem, and so naturally the story people told themselves fit the summer they were already living through. 2026 has been a brutal fire year across the American West. Oregon had already burned more than 2 million acres, a new state record. Nearly 100 large wildfires were burning uncontained across the country at the same time as Spokane's disaster, including 24 in Oregon and nearly 20 in Washington alone. National fire forecasters were projecting as much as 8 million acres burned by year's end. Extreme heat was gripping much of the country, with triple-digit highs stretching from Texas to California. Given all of that, the assumption was obvious. This was simply the West's brutal fire season claiming another victim, another casualty of drought, heat, and climate-fueled extremes. That assumption wasn't wrong about the region. It was wrong about this fire, because from the very first briefings, officials kept repeating one phrase: the cause remains under investigation. That's not unusual for a new wildfire. What was unusual was what investigators weren't finding. No lightning had struck the West Plains that afternoon. There was no downed power line reported at the ignition point, no equipment failure, no obvious industrial spark. In a region where utility equipment has started major fires before, that absence mattered. Something had started this fire, and for the first 2 days nobody could say what. The instinct, understandably, was to look at electricity. This isn't a region unfamiliar with utility-caused disasters. 3 years earlier, a fire near Medical Lake, just southwest of Spokane, had been traced to sparks from a faulty utility light. It destroyed 240 structures and killed 1 person. So when old trails ignited on a day with high winds, the same theory seemed reasonable. A line down, a spark, a spread. Nobody could stop in time. Investigators tested it. Crews checked the nearest power infrastructure for arcing, breaks, or failure consistent with a wind-caused outage, the exact chain of evidence that had convicted a utility company after the Medical Lake fire. This time, it didn't hold. A fire investigator's sworn statement filed with Spokane County prosecutors described the ignition pattern as consistent with an open flame applied directly to vegetation, the kind you'd get from a lighter or a match, not a spark from failing equipment. A flame placed there, on purpose. 2 days after the fire started, deputies arrested a 37-year-old Spokane man named Aaron Farinacci and charged him with first-degree arson. Court records describe him appearing by video link from jail, wearing a green t-shirt printed with the phrase, "Who needs luck? I have charm." The same shirt investigators say deputies first saw him in near the fire's origin point. Small detail. It stuck because it captured something unsettling about how casually this had apparently been done. His bond was set at $1 million, later doubled to $2 million. That alone reframes everything. This wasn't only a story about drought and wind, it was a story about a decision, but the decision turned out to be worse than a spontaneous, reckless one. Days later, according to detectives, Farinacci admitted something that changes the entire shape of this investigation. He said he had studied the methods of a known serial arsonist before choosing when to act. He had been watching weather forecasts, specifically tracking red flag warnings, waiting for exactly the kind of low humidity, high wind day the National Weather Service had flagged as dangerous. And investigators say he built a crude time delay ignition device out of notebook paper, a match, a cigarette, and a rubber band, designed to give him time to walk away before the flame reached the vegetation. This was not an accident that happened to occur during dangerous conditions. According to investigators, dangerous conditions were the entire point. He wanted the wind. That single detail is the mechanism behind everything that followed. A fire crew can usually outbuild a slow-moving blaze, cutting containment lines faster than flames can spread. They cannot outbuild a fire pushed by 40-mile-an-hour gusts through bone-dry grass into a city that was never designed to absorb wildland fire behavior. By choosing that specific weather window, prosecutors allege one person turned an ordinary ignition into something closer to an unstoppable event. And then the story widened again. As detectives kept digging, Farinacci reportedly confessed to setting roughly 25 fires going back to 2025. 4 additional arson charges followed, tied to blazes investigators had, for more than a year, treated as unrelated. The Aubrey Wildfire and a second fire near it in July of last year, the Equestrian Fire that August, and the Indian Bluff Fire just this past July, weeks before old trails ignited. For over a year, this region had logged a string of unexplained ignitions as isolated bad luck. They may not have been isolated at all. That's not a footnote. That's a fire department, a sheriff's office, and a community discovering that a pattern they never noticed had been running underneath their fire season for more than a year. Even as the criminal case widened, the fire itself refused to cooperate with recovery efforts. As crews pushed containment lines forward, incident commanders reported more than 40 illegal drone flights over the restricted airspace above the burn zone in a single week. Every time a drone goes up near an active fire, aircraft have to be grounded because a mid-air collision with a firefighting helicopter or air tanker is catastrophic. People chasing dramatic footage were, functionally, slowing the response to their own community's disaster. On top of that, hazardous materials crews had to be sent into the burned neighborhood starting the first week of August because an urban wildfire doesn't just burn trees, it burns cars, propane tanks, electronics, and building materials, all of which can leave toxic residue behind. This had stopped being a wildland fire story. It had become an urban disaster response, with an active criminal investigation running alongside it. And to put the scale in real perspective, consider this. Old Trails isn't even close to being the biggest fire burning in Washington state this year. The Kaiser Canyon fire, in more remote terrain across the state, has already burned more than 136,000 acres, close to 40 times the footprint of Old Trails. It barely made national news because it isn't threatening anyone's house. Old Trails proves the opposite case. A fire less than 4,000 acres in size became the most destructive wildfire disaster in the region's modern history, not because of its acreage, but because of exactly where the wind decided to push it. Size was never the variable that mattered. Location was. Meanwhile, the human cost kept climbing outside the fire line, too. Washington's Governor, Bob Ferguson, requested emergency federal support and spoke directly with the president, asking for an expedited disaster declaration. The state's congressional delegation wrote that hundreds of families had lost not just houses, but farms and livelihoods, with many still barred from returning to check on what remained. So here's where the story needs its historical anchor, because the comparison officials themselves reached for wasn't random. The Eaton and Palisades fires that tore through the Los Angeles area in January of last year shared a specific mechanism with what happened in Spokane. Extreme sustained wind meeting dry vegetation right at the edge of dense housing, producing a fire that moved faster than evacuation warnings could keep pace with. That's the real link, not the region, not the season, the mechanism. But the comparison has limits, and those limits matter. The Los Angeles fires were driven by Santa Ana winds funneling through steep, chaparral-covered canyons above densely built hillside neighborhoods. Spokane's fire crossed flat river terrain into pine and grass urban fringe, a completely different fuel type and topography. The wind was different, the vegetation was different. The trigger, as far as investigators can tell, was different too, since there's no evidence utility equipment or downed infrastructure played any role here. What's comparable is the physics. Wind-driven fire behavior overwhelming a community's assumptions about its own risk. What's not comparable is the cause, the terrain, or the scale of population exposed. Similarity in mechanism is not a prediction that every windy, dry city faces the same fate. There's a second comparison worth being careful with, too. Oregon's 2 million acre season is being called a modern record, and by the standard of satellite tracking and agency reporting, that's accurate. But fire records from a century ago rely on far patchier documentation, incomplete agency logs, and estimates reconstructed after the fact. Calling a season the worst ever mixes precise modern instrumentation with historical guesswork from an era when nobody was measuring burned acreage with anything like today's accuracy. The honest version of that claim is narrower, worst since reliable records began. Still serious, just not quite the same statement. That distinction actually clarifies the bigger regional question everybody keeps circling back to. Is Spokane's disaster connected to the broader Western outbreak, or is it a coincidence riding alongside it? Federal fire forecasters at the National Interagency Fire Center have been explicit about this. Their August outlook cites what they describe as a likely historic El Niño pattern, combined with a persistent zone of high pressure sitting over the northwestern United States, driving significant fire potential well above normal from central Utah through the Pacific Northwest coast. That's a real, verified atmospheric driver behind Washington's more than 600 wildfires this year and Oregon's record-breaking acreage. The regional outbreak is not imagined. It's measured, forecast, and according to that same outlook, expected to persist through the rest of August before any meaningful seasonal relief arrives. But that atmospheric pattern explains why the region was primed to burn. It does not explain why this specific fire became the deadliest disaster in modern Spokane history. The high-pressure system didn't choose August 1st. The wind didn't choose the West Plains. A person did, according to prosecutors, choose both, deliberately aligning a match with the exact weather conditions regional forecasters had already warned would turn any ignition catastrophic. The atmosphere built the stage, someone else picked the moment to walk onto it. So where does the investigation actually stand right now? What's confirmed, 3 fires, now managed together as the Spokane area fires, have burned a combined 10,300 acres since August 1st. More than 900 structures are confirmed damaged or destroyed, the overwhelming majority from old trails alone. As of the most recent incident updates, containment sits above 40% on Old Trails and Fairview, and above 60% on Autumn Lane, climbing steadily as crews exploit calmer weather windows. No deaths have been confirmed. What remains genuinely open, the final structure count, since assessment teams are still working through neighborhoods too hot to enter safely in the first week. The full scope of hazardous material exposure across burned residential blocks. And the true extent of what prosecutors have called Farinacci's criminal history, since they've stated the charges may be amended again as more evidence surfaces. What would change this assessment? Another red flag warning, and there's a real chance one arrives before the season turns, would test whether containment lines built this week can hold under repeated pressure. A wind shift, the kind that already reversed once and pushed smoke from a shielded interior corridor out toward Seattle and Portland, would extend the public health consequences of this fire far beyond Spokane County's borders, and any further charges connecting Farinacci to additional unexplained regional fires would force investigators to revisit a fire history they'd spent years treating as ordinary bad luck. Go back to where this started. A wildfire crossed a river into a city that had never planned for that kind of threat. And for the first 2 days, the entire regional conversation blamed climate, drought, and an unlucky spark. The climate context was real. The drought was real. Above normal fire potential across the Northwest this month is real, confirmed, and still forecast to continue. But the spark itself wasn't unlucky at all. Somewhere on the West Plains, according to investigators, a man watched a weather forecast, waited for the most dangerous wind conditions of the summer, and made a decision that turned a survivable grass fire into the worst disaster this city has recorded. If you were in Spokane County when the fires broke out, or you're watching smoke from this system somewhere along its path right now, it's worth saying out loud what you saw, because the fuller timeline of this investigation is still being built in real time. Right now, containment lines constructed by exhausted crews are being tested again against a landscape still smoldering, under an evacuation map that, in some zones, still reads active. The wind hasn't finished with Spokane, and neither has the investigation.